So, when you read the Bible, in some translations, well, all translations have verse numbers and chapters, right? But sometimes you have breaks in the text and there's like a heading, and it says, the prodigal son, right? Or Jesus curses the fig tree. And in this case, we would read halfway through the story, and then it would probably pause, and it would say, the widow's mite, M-I-T-E, not M-I-G-H-T. Well, when the Bible was written, there were no chapters or verses or headings or breaks at all. It was just one long text. We added that later to make it easier to read. And I think sometimes these breaks mess up the story. So the story of the widow's mite is traditionally held up as a positive example of stewardship. There's not a mistake that they put it in early November in the lectionary when it shows up. Because what is early November? It's pledge drive time, right? The woman was so faithful that she gave her last 2 coins to the temple. They were called lepta. And yes, she was a very faithful woman, I suppose. We don't get any insight into her character. We don't even talk to her. But a good example of stewardship in the sense that we talk about stewardship, she is not at all. Now, in ancient Israel, the poor people were not required to give anything to the temple because they knew that it was too much of a hardship. And if you could afford it, they wanted a tithe, 10% of your income, which is what we still hold up today as the gold standard for giving. So this widow puts every one of us to shame. She gives the temple 100% when she actually doesn't have to give them anything. So maybe the next time that we think 10% is a lot, we should think of the widow. My old bishop in Long Island used to say, if you can't survive on 90%, you really have no chance of making it on 100. But let's ignore the headings and ignore that, and ignore the chapters and verses and look at the story as a whole. So this story comes in the middle of Jesus criticizing the scribes and the Pharisees. He's leveling corruption charges against the temple system, not Judaism as a whole. He's talking about the leaders of the temple, who are the scribes. He says to beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. So, it's no coincidence that the story of the widow comes right after this part, where Jesus was just talking about widows. Jesus says that the scribes devour the widows' houses, meaning taking all their belongings, because remember, in ancient Israel, a widow had nothing, like Naomi in our Ruth story, Naomi and Ruth. They weren't allowed to work. They didn't have any income. If they didn't have any sons, they were alone. So they were the poorest of the poor people, very vulnerable. And so the scribes were being very predatory against them, which is not proper or right. So he points out an example. The example of the woman who's being taken advantage of by the scribes. A woman who is ignored by the scribes because they're too busy flitting about in their long robes. But Jesus points her out, whether he's praising her or lamenting the corrupt state of the temple, we don't really know. But the point is that he actually sees the woman. He notices her, whereas the scribes and even the disciples probably didn't even give her a second look. Just looked right through her, like she was dirt. According to James, pure religion is caring for the orphan and the widow, because in ancient times, the poorest of the poor people were orphans and widows. They were at the very bottom, and they needed the most help. And all the laws in the Old Testament are designed to protect the innocent. And the scribes were supposed to uphold those laws. But they let this poor widow give them all her money. So they weren't really caring about her anyway, were they? So Jesus is speaking out against corruption in the temple, about how they had forgotten the true meaning of worshiping God, which is to show love to your neighbor and to help each other. Now, the scribes and Jesus are fighting throughout all of Mark. Jesus challenges the system, and the theologian Emerson Powery calls the widow a positive object lesson, someone to observe. This is someone that proves Jesus' previous point, but also is a faithful and generous person. So the scribes, in all of their wealth and power, had simply just stopped noticing the widow, or in more general terms, noticing the needy people around them at all. They were supposed to be religious leaders, which implies that they would be pious and caring towards others. However, in the current to the time state of Israel was that it was under Rome. So these were rich aristocratic men appointed to their job by the Roman government in order to control people. So they were rich, and they were very wealthy, which is often confused with being smart or qualified for a job, then and now. They weren't necessarily pious people. Maybe they didn't know the law very well. They might not have been qualified to be scribes, but they had a high-powered job because they knew somebody, right? And Jesus says they liked wearing their fancy robes and getting respect, so they lost sight of the real world, the world that needed them. But Jesus sees it, and God sees it, and maybe that's the greater lesson here. God sees the woman, he cares for her, while the other people ignore her. And Jesus points this out, and points it out in us today too, how sometimes we can become blind to the need around us. But God sees it, and sees our struggles too, and our problems, and he cares for us when others won't. Maybe even more importantly, Jesus reminds us to not ignore others in need, because God cares about everybody, about us, about rich, about poor. We have to see God in all people, in every person that we meet. Even people we think we don't have anything in common with, because God cares about everybody. So today's story is very familiar, right? Like most Bible stories, because we hear them over and over. But sometimes we can look at it in a different way. The widow in the story is very faithful and generous, but her generosity is not to be emulated by us. We are in the middle of our stewardship pledge drive, which you're going to hear more about later on. This is when we ponder St. Anne's work in the world and our involvement. So think about that, and think about what you see and what you don't see. What do you see in town, in our community that needs help? Don't give everything, like the widow, right? We don't want to do that. My old boss used to say, don't give till it hurts, give till it feels good. It's a good motto. But always remember why we do the things we do. Because we love God. That's what it all comes down to. That's the motivation, and that's what the scribes are missing here. Now, the widow is generous to a fault today. But let's look at it a different way. What is Jesus talking about? It's all about love. It's about caring, loving our neighbors, and caring for each other in life. We first have to see the need around us, which you might not notice right away, but it's always there. Sometimes you have to look past a facade to see the need. We need to see that and really see our neighbors, and then always act in love to make the world better. And we do this always with Jesus' help. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.